Welcome to The Culture. We rest at the pulse of the community, providing all things news, music, fashion, events, and everything that we talk about in between. It's a lifestyle. We are The Culture. Hi, and welcome to The Culture. I'm your host, Jessica Garrett-Modkins, and joining us today, right now, is NAACP South Dade Chapter President, Senator Dwight Bullard. Welcome to the show.
Hey, always good to be on The Culture, Jessica. Happy to be here.
Yes, thank you. And for those of you who are tuning in, we are live. So if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and post those in the comment section on whichever platform you're watching us on, YouTube or Facebook. Let's start with Bill Cosby. Charges were vacated by the Philadelphia Supreme Court on this Wednesday. The state ruled that he was wrongly convicted. He's out of jail. He's been released and is receiving mixed sentiments. Why did the Supreme Court make this ruling?
So I think there's been a lot of confusion around, a declaration of innocence versus that of why he was released. In the case of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they made a determination that his Sixth Amendment had been violated, that he had not received a fair trial, and as a result, overturned the conviction in the lower court. So I think a lot of people, of course, the internet being what the internet is, they get, exuberant, excited about the idea. You have people on both sides of the issue, um, who had been on both sides of the issue from the time he had been charged and thus convicted. But in this case, this is, the right that each and every one of us is supposed to have, which is the right to a fair trial, the right to you know, uh, proper attorneys and making sure that there's no corruption in the system. Now, one could argue that Black people have not been the beneficiary, over the history of this country. But in the case of Mr. Cosby, his lawyers were able to show just cause for overturning his conviction.
And what type of precedent does this set for other prosecutors?
Well, the thing that I think people should really be concerned about, like, the good old smoke and mirrors, is that his lawyers are basically making the argument that juries were prejudiced, that there was too much hoopla and too much press around his initial conviction to really justify a fair trial. Now, if this sounds familiar, we just went through a very, very public trial in the case of Officer Derek Chauvin, in which people were very perturbed that he only received 22 years in prison, or a 22-year prison term. What his lawyers can ultimately appeal is ultimately the same thing. The question becomes: was his trial, thus his conviction, prejudiced by too much press, or by a jury that had already been determined to be biased? And then you also saw immediately after that there was the incident in which one of the jurors, I think they tried to associate him with the Black Lives Matter rally, and was he biased by this, and all these things that had come up. And so, in appeal, which is his lawyer's right, you're going to wonder whether or not this same sentiment, the same ideology, or heck, the precedent from this case itself might serve as justification, unfortunately, for them overturning his conviction. And I hope that's not the case, but just be on the lookout, because the challenge with rulings in higher courts like this is that lawyers can now use this case as precedent to justify the release of their clients.
Now, I understood his conviction being overturned or vacated because of some sort of pre-trial conversation that Cosby had with a separate prosecutor.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that could be it as well, right? I mean, there has been conversation around a 2005 conversation he had, kind of polluting the water around the 2015 trial that took place, and whether or not there were some pretrial discussions. That also kind of factors into this whole Sixth Amendment conversation, and it does run deep. But nonetheless, you still have this notion of prejudicial precedence, in terms of what carries more weight. I think the point you're bringing up is, like, there was a discussion in 2005 about one set of circumstances, and was the rush to get him convicted later on, that 10 years later, again polluted by the presence of the Me Too movement, the presence of all these other folks, being convicted. And so it is, when the legalese gets into it, it's still one of those things that, unfortunately, because now that this has happened, now that the Supreme Court has made this decision, you're going to have a number of lawyers come along and say, "Ooh, this might be an opportunity to get my client off under these kind of vague circumstances." So
And then I also understand that Bill Cosby cannot be tried again on these same charges.
now, I'm not sure about that one. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. But but you know, depending upon the case, like if they're saying that he did not receive a fair trial, that doesn't necessarily play into double jeopardy, which is what you're talking about. The idea that you can't be tried twice for the same crime. Um, that I think is a more complicated and to be determined kind of circumstance. I think the prosecutors in Pennsylvania are going to, you know, really have to sit down and make a determination on, time served, the value in going, in pursuing this again. Or, you could argue the Pennsylvania Supreme Court case all the way up to the US Supreme Court case. If you so chose, they have the right to appeal as well. Um, and but all that's factored into the fact that he is of an advanced age, right? So, what is what then is the goal, right?
Mhm.
And so that's going to be, yeah, that's going to be a look down the road, and a lot of factors kind of being weighed in, to whether or not he's up for the long haul. But but one thing I want to stress is, and put my conspiracy theory hat on, is, when you think about these higher profile cases, whether it be this, whether it be OJ Simpson, you're talking about, you know, wealthy, powerful, black men that are taken through a very, very expensive process. We're talking about millions of dollars in legal fees, millions of dollars in civil court damages that will ultimately be awarded or are being asked for by people. Um, and basically trying to, drain the bank accounts of these folks to the point where they're they're left penniless. And we've heard this sad story over and over again when it comes to black entertainers, where the legal system kind of just extracts all kinds of wealth away from them, and thus undermines the overall wealth of the community. So that's a whole thing as well. Is like, is it? And I bring this up because, is it more punishment to serve the time, or is it more punishment to hurt the pockets? You know what I mean, of somebody. You know what I mean. And in this case, he has served time, and he's now also expending, all this money, to try to defend himself. And if, again, the lower, if the prosecutors decide to appeal to a higher court, Court of Appeal, U.S. Court of Appeals, U.S. Supreme Court around this case, that's, a lot more money you got to spend as well. Not all, and very few of us got it like that.
Yes. Let's go back to Derek Chauvin. You mentioned his sentencing in 22 and a half years. What does this conviction mean for the world first, and then we can kind of drill down into policing?
Yeah, I mean, full stop, it's a step in the right direction. I mean, this is the highest number of years of a criminal conviction for a police officer in one of these cases, right? But I think where a lot of people are frustrated is by just the criminal justice system as a whole, because we've talked about the presence of things like federal mandatory minimums, the difference or disparity between sentencing around crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and you start hearing folks who are still serving time from the 80s or 90s, these 30-year sentences. You think about 10/20 life or three strikes laws that have been disproportionately applied to Black people, where you're hearing stories of people who are doing life because their third conviction was stealing a cheeseburger, or stealing $9, or stealing a Snickers bar because of these kind of wayward state laws that have them now serving life sentences. And then here you have Derek Chauvin, who murdered a human being live on television, um, and is doing 22 years with only 15 of those set before he can apply for parole. And then the question becomes, after those 15 years, what happens then? Because he'll be able to sit there and say, well, I was a good police officer up until I murdered this man, right? And I was a stalwart in my community, and making all these claims, and may not even serve the full 22 years. So people are frustrated by that. People are frustrated because, surprise, surprise, the criminal justice system is racist, and they're just fed up with how one person gets served justice versus other people.
Now he's going to have to stand trial still on federal civil rights case, that federal civil rights charges. Well, he might not stand trial, because I do understand that there's a plea deal underway. Have you heard about that?
Yeah. What the if I again, not a lawyer, but if I played his lawyer on TV, I'd make the argument that because the lower court already assessed 22 years, that any federal charges can be done concurrently. So it's really going to be up to the federal prosecutor to make a determination on whether or not they got a good enough case to get more years tacked on to the 22 years that he's already serving. Um, but if not, that's going to be their thing. Is that they would also kind of label him with that felony conviction on federal charges, or plea out that as a concurrent uh, term of his already existing sentence. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll have more on Derek Chauvin, voting rights, gentrification, all of it when we take this quick break. We'll be right back.
Hit me with your best shot. Come on and hit me with your best shot. Hit me with your best shot. Fire away.
The COVID-19 vaccine is here. We're giving it our best shot for a strong, healthy community. Find out more at miamidade.gov/vaccine. Take your best shot at life. Get vaccinated.
And welcome back. We're here with Senator Dwight Bullard, president of the South Dade chapter for the NAACP, and we're talking Derek Chauvin. As it relates to his conviction and the civil rights charges that are forthcoming, it's not forthcoming, but the civil rights charging. What type of precedent does this set for policing, period?
Well, again, I ideologically, it creates now an accountability mechanism for future officers uh, who get involved in these kinds of circumstances. But these are always and have been tricky cases to prosecute. A lot of folks, over the last, let's say over the last 7 years, we've seen, circumstance after circumstance of police officers being involved in severe brutality, killing individuals, and unfortunately, the Chauvin verdict is a rarity, right? When we think about, the killing of Alton Sterling, or the choking of Eric Garner, or the killing of Michael Brown, where these officers, again, were caught on videotape killing these folks, and you know haven't served a day uh, in prison. These are the things that kind of stick out in people's minds. However, at least we now know that there is a possibility of the thing, right? Which is something that we did not have in the past. So, I personally kind of struggle with it because, as president in the NAACP, we deal with a number of civil rights issues, a number of, folks who've been victimized by law enforcement. Um, and I'm sure each of the branch presidents has a story or stories that come across their desk when it comes to these things, oftentimes never ending in the conviction of the officer. And so, trying to both sow hope among people who have been, disheartened by previous outcomes is part of the job, but it's also personally frustrating because, you still unfortunately have, whether it's younger siblings, nieces and nephews, sons and daughters, that you still have to have these conversations with on how to interact, how to survive, how to make it back, instead of just being able to be their whole selves and know that an interaction with police will end with them still being alive. And that's still the frustrating and challenging part of just being black in America.
Let's stay right there. Let's talk about gentrification, climate gentrification. How does it impact our neighborhoods? And are there measures that can support our communities long term in regards to climate change?
Well, the easiest measure is buy up the block. You know what I mean? I think what people haven't adjusted their minds to is the broken record, right? This idea that black neighborhoods, we see, kind of the coordination between the banking industry, government, all the normal entities to kind of devalue black neighborhoods when they're black neighborhoods. And then all of a sudden, someone who doesn't look like us buys up, a block or buys up portions of a neighborhood, and all of a sudden the value goes up, you know, two, three, 400%. In the case of Little Haiti, the Magic City developers come along and they put a few storefronts, put a glossy shine on, and all of a sudden you're like, wait. You're telling me these properties are now worth $1 million when, in the mid 80s, early 90s, you know, they were less than 100,000. Something, something's wrong with that. And the application of that is problematic. But on the climate side, what we have to worry about here in Miami, especially, is that much of Miami sits below sea level, especially when you think about places like Miami Beach. We saw what happened in Surfside, and a lot of that has to do with, the way in which the ground there had softened over the last few decades. The building itself that collapsed, you know, had been sinking into the ground, and they were talking about undergirding and reinforcing that. But I want people to understand, if you've already got an unstable ground, all it takes is a slight shift to create a crack in the foundation, and thus that creation of that crack in the foundation means that the building's off center. And so it's a disaster waiting to happen. And so for all of the condos along Surfside, you have to now, instead of doing what is the 4 year uh, determination on whether or not the building is safe and sound, have to go through these annual processes. But folks are eventually just going to say, forget it, I'm going to sell this condo. And they're going to be looking for places, nearby. And when you think about where Black communities sit oftentimes within 10 to 15 minutes of coastal communities because historically, beachfront property was considered white property. So, you know, the properties along Biscayne Boulevard, properties on the beach, the properties in Surfside, properties in Golden Beach have traditionally been white neighborhoods. But if you just go 15, 20 minutes across the bridge, you start running into communities like North Miami, start running into communities like Little Haiti, start running into communities like Overtown and Liberty City, and we think of places like 7th Avenue or 10th Avenue or 12th Avenue Northwest that have been these traditional Black corridors that are now appealing to developers, appealing to people to say, well, if we can move these folks out, we can convert these into flourishing communities a la a Wynwood or a la a Magic City development like you're seeing in places like Overtown and Little Haiti. And so going back to the original point, if you know that your property is sitting on one of these corridors or off one of these artery roads, hold on to it. Hold on to it. Right now, we're at a point now where banks, can't do some of the unscrupulous things that they've done in the past to Black people. So you can get a lower interest loan to redo your property. You can refinance at a higher rate and a better rate than you ever have as a Black person because now the flashlight is on these institutions to do right and stop being discriminatory towards communities. So now's the time to kind of like take ownership on your property, and shout out to folks who've already been doing that, like the infamous Broadway, who's bought up a lot of 18th Avenue, and continues to kind of like hold our blocks uh, in co-op with the rest of the Black community.
Nice. Critical race theory in public schools. Can you just explain all of that? There's discussion on the internet and they're likening it to whitewashing history.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, the reality of critical race theory is that it was a legal terminology that came out that was applied to academia that basically says that you can't decouple the good, bad, and ugly of the American experience without the application of race. Like folks don't, and folks don't understand the depth of it, right? But I'll give you one example. Well, give you kind of two basic examples. Imagine trying to tell someone about the Tulsa Race Massacre without the application of race, right? Now, Greenwood is the Black community, affluent community. You had banks, you had hotel owners, you had all these that were Black, and you had a white community that ultimately destroyed that Black community. Now, try to tell that story without, first kind of talking about the notion that it was Black people that populated this space, or that race had something to do, with the massacre. I challenge anyone to try and do that. It'd be darn near impossible. But I'll take it a step further. A lot of people don't know that FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, that we all, utilize to get home loans or subsidize home loans and buy our first homes with, was once applied on racial lines. Like the FHA, by design and by statute, would not give loans to Black people explicitly. Like the housing secretary said, we would only give it out because they wanted to create the white suburbia, right? And so you had scenarios where that doesn't happen. And then for our own, history, Jessica, as you know, Frank C. Martin was able to manipulate that system to make a guarantee that Black veterans could use their GI Bill to apply towards a home loan, but only under the guise that it was in a particular Black enclave or Black-owned neighborhood that would ultimately become Richmond Heights. So when people think about that, like, you can't tell the story of Richmond Heights as a community without first applying the fact that there were discriminatory practices against Black people, even those who had served their country, to move into other neighborhoods. Like, these World War II veterans weren't able to, apply this to Coral Gables. They weren't able to apply this to Miami Beach. They weren't able to apply this to certain parts of the city of Miami. It was the creation of a suburban enclave that at that time was in the middle of nowhere, right, where these individuals were able to do it. So just kind of letting folks know that critical race theory is really telling the truth about the circumstances in this country. And it doesn't even just apply to Black people. You can't talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a federal policy that discriminated against Asian people, or the Indian Removal Act, which was a federal policy that intentionally discriminated against Native Americans and indigenous people. You can't tell that kind of story without this application of critical race. And so people need to stop bastardizing what the terminology means. People need to, get out their feelings about my child's going to feel bad if they learn the truth about America, because they've had no problem making Black children feel bad the other way around. So, I think it's time for folks to start to learn and understand the truth of the country that we live in order for it to get better. Like, no one's in a rush to move to another place. They just simply want the same broad brush of fairness and equity and equality applied to everybody, as opposed to just select few.
And doesn't Juneteenth fall within this discussion? We have a federal holiday now.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. It's a federal holiday about how 2 months after the Civil War was over, people learned about something that had been drafted 2 years before. Like, if nothing speaks to the inequality and the lack of application of certain policies, Juneteenth should be it. I mean, the idea that these folks in Texas should have been free already, but were finally told of their freedom in June of 1865. And just, again, for those who might have failed 8th grade history, the Civil War ended in April of 1865. So we're talking about folks that were just, still doing free labor, even though the war was over and even though the Emancipation Proclamation had come out in January of 1863. That should be, something that somebody puts on a T-shirt moving forward around the application of critical race theory.
Well, I mean, we can continue to talk. We didn't get into a couple of topics that I did want to talk about, but we're going to have to bring you back. We've run out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Senator Bullard, for always educating us and bringing us up to speed on things that matter most to our community. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And also thank you all for tuning in, sending in your words of affirmation. We appreciate you. Don't forget to watch us here tonight at The Culture. Join us at 6 p.m. on YouTube Live, on Facebook Live for another edition of My 2 Cents. Grab a drink and set your clock for a good time. Like, share, and subscribe. And we'll check you out tonight. Thanks for joining us.
The Culture is produced and owned by the Culture Media Group and cannot be reproduced or broadcast without written consent. All rights reserved 2021.